Hello, everyone. Welcome back to A New Crusade. Today, I am talking with Caesar Australis. He is someone that I discovered on Instagram probably a few months ago, maybe about 6 months ago. I don't remember exactly how I found him, but one of the first things I saw from him was, I believe, an article he had written. I could be wrong, but I think he wrote an article on diaspora communities and how they preserve culture. You wrote an article on that, didn't you?
I've written several posts on it. I'm currently working on an article, but no, I haven't yet posted it.
Then maybe I read one from something else, or maybe you had commented something small on your story or something. But I found you somehow on Instagram, and then I followed you on Twitter, but you're a lot more active on Instagram than you are on Twitter. So I mainly keep up with your stuff there. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone?
Yeah, I'm Caesar Australis. I've been pretty active online for some years now. I'm a Roman historian mostly by trade. Um, I've traveled Europe a lot, especially in Rome. I've spent a lot of time in Rome, which is obviously my niche area of academics. Obviously, I'm a political commentator a lot. I speak on cultural issues. I've always believed that history is a is the best predictor of future outcomes in terms of culture and politics and the human nature. So it is always something that I've felt has connected the most into my area, I believe. Whether it's religion, politics, culture, I've always believed that the more you know about your history, the more you see beyond contemporary political and cultural fog, and you can always better predict where the future will go, I believe.
Hmm. And then I guess for the context of this channel, for everyone, you are a Catholic, right?
Yes, so I'm a devout Roman Catholic.
Yes, I'm a Ruthenian Catholic as of pretty recently. I was baptized like a few last year. Are you a
Oh,
cradle
that's so
Catholic?
neat. I'm a cradle
Yes.
Catholic in a technical sense, but I mean, I'm sure most Catholics these days are fully aware that doesn't really mean too much. So I went through a reconversion sort of a few years out of high school.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, pretty much. I've heard you either have a conversion story or a reversion story, and that these days that's pretty much how it is for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I always felt very close to Saint Augustine of Hippo in that regard. I've always considered him one of my patron saints because he's always been a saint that I've felt very close to in the sense of his conversion story and his upbringing, and his search for truth, especially through Roman history.
Yeah, I've seen you saying that. So, what exactly started your I guess interest into being a historian, and what's kind of the process that started you down that path?
History has always been a passion of mine, especially Greco-Roman history. I'm from an Italian family, Italian background, so it's always been an area of interest that I've felt particularly connected to. I've written a lot in the past about, I believe, strong belief in ethnic memory, I guess, or blood memory, as some commentators would call it. Sort of that innate connection you feel with a native land, and it's something that I've always felt strongly whenever I've been in Italy and even Greece. So it's always been an area I've been very connected to, and something that always felt very passionate about. Some of the earliest stories that I've always been interested in as a child were, the conquest of Julius Caesar in Gaul and his adventures in Egypt with Cleopatra, and from there, it's always something I've delved more and more into throughout my childhood. And as I got older, it sort of expanded into other areas like Egypt, early medieval Europe, Anglo-Saxon history is also sort of a niche academic area that I've studied a lot. But no, Roman history has always been something that I've always felt very passionate about. I've lived in Rome for a time as well, and also as a Catholic, there's that other level of connection that I've always felt. So whenever I've been in Rome, it's always this undescribable feeling that I've had, especially in places like the catacombs and the Via Appia. Sort of this convergence of spiritual connection as a Catholic and ethnic connection, cultural connection, all blending into one, and it's this indescribable feeling that I've always felt in Rome. So it's always been something that I've always been very passionate and connected to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think something I've really appreciated from seeing you talk about is that part of what you've talked about, that I think a lot of especially more mainstream Catholics, they'll kind of fall into this like, we're the universal church, like people groups don't matter. Especially in America, you'll hear it a lot. They'll talk about, for example, like immigration, and they'll say, I don't care who comes over, they're bringing their rosaries with them, so it's not a big deal. And I've had to tell people in the past, I'm like, yeah, that, well, partially that's just not true, but also like, it's not that simple, And I think that in a lot of places online, it's very often just that from like a Catholic perspective, or it's kind of an unsavory perspective from people talking about kind of the preservation of their cultures and their people groups. It can oftentimes be from people who maybe don't quite line up with our beliefs always, and it can kind of seem like it's hard to kind of find a middle ground. And it's definitely there, I think. But as far as being at kind of the forefront of what's popular right now, it's definitely not the most common. That's something I've appreciated from reading some of the content you've put out, even just on like kind of your Instagram story and some of the posts you'll make and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's very hard in the modern setting, especially in this post-World War II setting in Western Europe and culture, Western culture, trying to find this nuance between the two extremes. You have one extreme that doesn't want to acknowledge any kind of difference and believes in the universal brotherhood of man to this it's a very Masonic, revolutionary, postmodern idea of what it means to be brotherly. But then the other hand, you have the very hardcore National Socialist eugenics focus on ethnicity, where it's becomes an idol, where race, this racial idolatry, where nothing matters more than race, and everything should come secondary to race. And it's hard to find this nuance, because it's very easy to fall into these two extremes. If you embrace one, you reject the other, and it's a difficult topic to talk about, because both sides will group you in with the other. So if you acknowledge race, then you're going to be grouped in with those who racial idolaters, and if you want to acknowledge the universal creation of the image of God in man, you're going to be grouped in with these modernists who want to not acknowledge any kind of difference whatsoever between different peoples of the world. It is a very difficult topic to talk about, but it's always been my belief that by not acknowledging these differences in the modern world, we only give way to we only empower both ideologies. So, for example, if you refuse to acknowledge certain truths of one side, so for example, with National Socialist Germany, they made a lot of points about the certain Masonic and Zionist influences in the media in Europe, in Russia, with Bolsheviks, and Wall Street influences into Europe as well from America. By refusing to acknowledge the truths in those claims and ideologies, we are empowering them, because by questioning one thing, we question everything. So something I admire about G.K. Chesterton is the fact that he was one of these first people to criticize Adolf Hitler and National Socialism years before everyone. So this was years before World War II. One of the things that G.K. Chesterton brought up was the fact that the Jews of Europe, especially in Germany, had created the monster that was persecuting them. But the other thing about Chesterton is he both criticized National Socialism, but he also defended some of the nuanced factors that went into creating National Socialism. Winston Churchill himself sort of acknowledged in an article in the 1920s, I think it was the New London Times, I believe, from the top of my head, in his article called Bolshevism versus Zionism. And it was basically acknowledging these two different factions of Jewish interests in Europe. One was in creating the Zionist movement, which was interested in creating the modern state of Israel. The Bolshevik movement, which was interested in establishing communist interests in Europe. So like the Bolshevik Russia, the Russian Revolution, there were attempted communist coups in Germany. So something I admire about Chesterton is the way that he was able to acknowledge these nuances in the factors that had created National Socialism, while also being able to condemn the errors that had manifested from it. And I think that's the dilemma that we find ourselves in the modern world, is we need to be able to acknowledge the truth of both sides if we don't want to alienate the truth that exists on both sides. Yeah, you see this very complicated post-war narrative when it comes to World War II, and a lot of the time is, you get figures like General Patton, for example. He's very much venerated by U.S. conservatives even today. He's very much a patriotic figure, but it's interesting the way that he's venerated by the same people who tend to venerate, for example, Israel and the sort of Judeo-Christian sort of notion of modern Christian conservatism. But Patton himself was very critical of the politics of the war. He both fought the Nazis, but he was also very honest and blunt about the Jewish influences in the media, especially in the narrative of post-war, the post-war narrative of the conflict. You also see this issue with the different ideologies between things like fascism and National Socialism, for example. It's difficult to, it's important to differentiate the differences between even fascism and National Socialism, and even the differences between how fascism has manifested between different countries. For example, fascism in Spain was very Catholic focused in its purpose. It's the Spanish Civil War is very much a modern crusade, opposed to National Socialism, which was very much about the banking and political interests of Germany and how Germany had been tarnished by the consequences of World War One, opposed to Italy, which had its own series of economic and post-war World War One consequences that they had to deal with. Even British fascism, which is more parliamentary in its nature, with Oswald Mosley. So it's a very difficult topic to even talk about, because even fascism, you have to differentiate between the different movements and the different figures and the different purposes, because it's you can't simply just put it all under one blanket. And it's even with communist movements and socialist movements, it's hard. It's very easy to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's very difficult to talk to, especially U.S. conservatives who tend to be very capitalist, about the nature of regulations with the economy in terms of workers' rights, tariffs, things like that. When you're very free market focused, it's hard to have a frank discussion about how regulations can be within the best interest of a national movement.
Yeah, definitely. That was something that was very difficult for me. Prior to my conversion, I was very much a fan of kind of like Hoppian libertarianism. Like, I would have called myself an anarcho-capitalist, and very quickly into starting to read into stuff once I had decided, or I was looking into Catholicism, and I had very quickly read a couple different people talking about how libertarianism isn't really like isn't doesn't work within like a Catholic framework. And I kind of said, okay, I can't be libertarian. Well, then what am I going to be? And so that's a big part of why I've enjoyed making this channel and reading into a lot of stuff and looking into different stuff, because it's been kind of finding a replacement for what I had thought. And a big part of that, like you're saying, from an American perspective, is kind of divorcing yourself from believing that liberalism is always good, and that freedom in the American sense is always good, and that capitalism is always good. And it does make conversations difficult.
Yeah, exactly. And it's the same point that I make when I talk about things like monarchy or any kind of feudalism. When someone challenges the clan or new feudal idea based on the idea on grounds of unfairness, I begin to be asking, what they mean by fair. If fairness is taken to mean a perfectly level distribution of wealth and rank, then no past or present society qualifies for that. What can be measured instead is whether the burden and privileges of each station are proportionate and constrained by an acknowledged moral law. Traditional Catholic teaching doesn't tend to favor free market systems or individualist systems any more than it does with communism, which is very collectivist. It doesn't favor either ultra individualism or ultra collectivism. It's sort of Catholic social teaching and historical precedence tends to favor, this middle ground, between the two. And it's kind of hard for a lot of people to sort of divorce themselves, as you would say, from the contemporary understanding of politics. Since the French Revolution, we very much think in in terms of right wing and left wing. And the problem is, how do you define what is right wing and what do you define as what is left wing? Traditionally speaking, to be right wing meant to be favor being a monarchist, in the traditional French revolutionary sentiment, opposed to being left wing, which is Republican. But in the American setting, to be right wing is to be a Republican civic nationalist, and to be a Democrat, at least in the current system, is to be more liberal socialist side. And it's like I said, to be right wing and left wing is constantly changing, and it's very hard to define what it means to be these things, because traditionally speaking, if you were talking about Western European values, you wouldn't be talking about people being able to vote their leader and be able to do whatever they want. You'd be talking about kings, feudal lords, village elders, being submissive to a higher authority, whether it's the church, whether it's a priest, whether it's a king. Everyone has a social rank in traditional Western values, and it's not a traditional Western value to be favoring this completely libertarian system, which is very much a post-revolutionary one, influenced by Freemasonry, especially in the 1700s. As we know, Masonic lodges were a big part of both the American and French revolutions, and that is the framework where we get a lot of our modern idea of what it means to be left-wing or right-wing.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has really helped me kind of understand since becoming Catholic and starting to learn more about Catholic social teaching, since speaking with a lot of friends, especially looking into what you were talking about, and this is another reason I've identified a lot with your writings, from a monarchist perspective and kind of a feudalist perspective. I know something I've talked a lot about with some of my friends is how kind of St. Thomas outlines that, the acceptable forms of governance being like an aristocracy, a monarchy, and a democracy, but obviously with monarchy being the highest out of all of them. And something I've talked about with one of my friends is he's someone who I had interviewed in my last video, is that we were talking about how in a healthy society, especially kind of in a medieval Christian society, you often see kind of a healthy representation of all three of these through, a king ruling over the land and his lords ruling over smaller pieces of land. And then oftentimes you might have had, leadership of mayors of towns being voted in and things like that. And so you kind of see this healthy, organic society. And oftentimes, I think when you read Catholic social teaching in light of what a truly Catholic society looks like, it actually becomes pretty easy to understand. The problem is just that our societies are so revolutionary that understanding them through this modern context is very difficult.
Yeah, well, I speak a lot, and I write a lot about neo-feudalism. And when someone asks me how I would define neo-feudalism, I would say it's a deliberate restoration of an older Catholic pattern in which a network of related households or lands in common live in common under a localized head. And it's precisely that, an older Catholic pattern. And it's not just, or even not just Catholic, even pre-Christian European society was very much hereditary in its nature. Even Rome in its earliest days began as a village under a king. Some of the earliest civilizations were tribes, clans. Even up to the 19th century, countries like Ireland, Scotland still lived in the clan system. Clans such as the MacDonalds and McGregors and Campbells and Frasers and dozens of others who held their glens as collective estates, each member owing mutual defense, arms, labor to their chief and clans, as well as religious duties such as the maintenance of local churches or abbeys. This is generally how our ancestors lived across the board in different. It varied in different contexts and how it manifested, but generally speaking, that is how our ancestors lived up until the revolutionary era of Western Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Even during the American Revolution, I've written about how many Americans were expecting a new king of America. They weren't expecting. Not everyone was expecting a republic. A lot of people had the sentiment that they were going to have an American king for themselves. I believe a Prussian prince was even invited by Congress to be the king of the United States during that era. Obviously, it didn't go through. But it just shows that even up to the revolutionary period of America, these sentiments were shared by a lot of common folk. This idea that, people historically just saw the notion of a king as some burden or, some oppressive force is just not the reality of how our ancestors perceived authority. St. Thomas Aquinas, who wrote, we get a lot of our social teachings on these sort of political structures, was also influenced by Aristotle, and I've written a lot about how the Romans and Greeks, or at least not even just the Romans and Greeks, all throughout medieval Europe as well, tyranny was not typically defined as the existence of power. Tyranny was the abuse of power by any kind of authority, whether that could come from a democratic regime, just as well as a dictatorship or even a monarch. The mere existence of authority and power was not in itself tyrannical. It was how it was exercised.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the topics we had talking about that I think we've kind of developed a bit of a natural segue into, you're talking about kind of living a familial life, kind of a broader, broader expression of that would be kind of with, either your ethnic group or your race or whatever term you want to use. To anyone speaking in good faith, it's kind of obvious what's meant by that generally. And one thing I'm kind of curious about from your perspective, I know that you obviously have ties, like you've said, you're from Australia, but you have ties as well to Italy. And there's definitely, from what I can tell, at least, a big difference between the possibility of establishing a system like that in either one of those places. Myself, living in America, specifically in the West, we're much less connected to our racial identities than our counterparts on the East Coast are often. The ethnic enclaves in the West oftentimes weren't maintained as well. Kind of a part of the frontier mentality as well, and even less than that, obviously, when compared to Europe. And I'm curious, how do you see the possibility of the establishment of those systems, or as kind of an analysis of that, being present in these kind of different levels of, I guess as we've moved away from those traditional lifestyles, how do you see it being possible to return there? Or what's your kind of analysis on that situation?
I would say it would have to manifest differently in each place. How neo-feudalism or any kind of monarchy would manifest in Australia is very different to how it would manifest in the United States, or how it would manifest in the United States would be different to Italy or France or England. Western Europe is a little bit easier because they have cultural and historical precedents for these things. Even today, as modern as Italy has become, you still very much see this communal Catholic cultural precedence in day-to-day life. Old people will still walk down to the local cafe, hang out with their friends, and then come back for lunch and with their children who come back from work. It's very different to, say, in Australia or the US, where you'll put your elderly to waste away in a retirement home, and you spend all day at work, and then you come home at the end of the day, and maybe your spouse will also be there. Traditionally speaking, yes, but obviously in more recent decades, it's become the reality that also your spouse also needs to work, so it's even more division in the household. But yeah, so it would manifest differently between each country and place, and even within the US. Obviously, different parts of the US, different states have their own different cultural, ethnic, and even religious histories. I think the issue with the US, especially in the post-Civil War US, you've got this centralization or yankification of the American South. So traditionally, the American South, especially places like Louisiana and Florida, used to be more traditionally French or Spanish, even places like California and Texas. So I think there needs to be this sort of push to look into our histories and identities that transcends not just the past few decades, or not just the past 100 years or 150 years, however so long it's been. You see this movement in places like Louisiana, for example, this revival movement in trying to relearn their French dialects, like different Cajun dialects. Same with Florida, different sort of Spanish movements wanting to revive their Spanish heritage, cultural heritage in the area. Places like Maryland, which was once Catholic and was sort of pushed out by the Protestants in post-revolutionary America. So I think it's more about trying to look at your history that transcends how it's been set in the contemporary context. For example, I don't think Italians should look at just post-revolutionary Italy. The unification of Italy came about with a war against the Papal States and the monarchies of Italy, such as the Kingdom of Naples, the Kingdom of Two Sicilies. So I think Italians, for example, need to look beyond that to Renaissance Italy, to the Roman Empire, to the Roman Republic, to their local regional cultures and dialects. It's more about a rejection of the terms that we've been set in contemporary context. I think in places like Louisiana, for example, in the US, they need to look towards their French heritage, their French and Spanish heritage, look into relearning their local languages, their local traditions, and perhaps even inventing new ones. In the North, it's going to be a bit different because, like I said, each state and region of a US state is going to have a different local tradition of ethnicity, of culture, religion. It's the same with Australia, but the thing is with Australia, unlike the US, Australia has a very strong Anglo identity in its foundation. So up to the 1960s, you legally had to be British, ethnically British, to be considered an Australian. It wasn't until the late 1960s that the White Australia policy was abolished. It's a little bit different to the US, which has always had more of a mix in cultures and religions and ethnicities. But the problem with Australia's being set is Australia doesn't have a strong connection with its British identity anymore. We've had a lot more immigration of, especially from places like India and Asia, Southern Asia, like the Philippines. So I think it's very much about trying to reinvigorate local identities with shared heritage. I believe that white Australians, especially those with a British background, which generally probably would not include myself, because I tend to identify more with my Italian side. I believe that Anglo-Australians should more tend towards group together in terms of their living conditions. The same neighborhoods, the same towns, the same streets. And likewise, I think that should happen in the US. Each different state, different areas of the state, they should sort of begin to live together more communally in terms of the same street. And that's how Catholics traditionally have lived, even up into the modern era. Obviously places like New Jersey, New York, you would see the division of Italians, Irish, even Mexicans, things like that, different ways of immigration. And up through the 20th century, you very much see this communal identity of different neighborhoods. Places like Hell's Kitchen, which in New York, which is very much an Irish identity, that's only really been abolished over the past couple decades. So I think that's the path. The path forward is more about going backwards and not just thinking in terms of the modern state that we've been given in definitions of what we are.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. For me, understanding that, I think it's difficult on a personal level due to, especially living in the Western United States, a large amount of the population, basically like post Dust Bowl and all that, was a large amount of kind of Midwestern Anglos moving over, and then very quickly they've been, very, very soon they'll be basically completely replaced by Hispanics. They're only on the trend for that, and so it's been difficult from a personal perspective, especially me. I don't have any super strong racial identities personally as a result of that mixture. And so because of that, I have a little bit of a difficulty identifying with specific ideas like that, just from a personal perspective, even though I kind of understand it. And so putting myself in the shoes, especially as I've met kind of New Yorkers or met a lot more European people, it's become much more clear. They really have an idea of who they are. And a lot of it is really just about them kind of deciding what's important to them, whether or not the establishment of these communities is worth it to them, and whether or not it's worth it for them to kind of make that first step.
Yeah, and I find it interesting. I've written an article about it a few months ago about this sort of resentment that grows between mainland Europeans and them American colonial counterparts, especially. So, for example, like Italian Americans and Italian Irish often get a lot of flack from national Italians and national Irish about what it means to be Italian and Irish. This resentment, I even saw it when I was in Europe. A lot of the local Italians really did not like American Italians, despite the fact that they were essentially cousins. Um, Europeans will often accuse their American counterparts of like misrepresenting or commercializing their heritage and identity. So I find it it's an interesting progression in how things have developed in regards to the colonial identity. But you know, I can certainly understand this sentiment to an extent. Obviously, with things like the pop culture idea of what it means to be an Italian in America. Things like The Godfather or Bronx Tale. Even when I was living in Rome, I had this experience where I'd be walking towards past the Colosseum and I'd hear a group of Italian Americans talk about how rich their culture is because of these movies, and it's easy to understand why some people have this resentment, especially when even with the Irish seeing the commercialization of St. Patrick's Day becoming a sort of like Americanized drunken celebration, which to an extent comes from Ireland anyway. But there is, however, this hypocrisy and elitism in that sort of identity and or perspective of identity, because the same people who are accomplices to massive immigration. So back in Europe, there are people in Italy and Ireland who will criticize their colonial brethren in America, but at the same time be pushing mass immigration into their own country. The same people who are criticizing their American colonial counterparts are the same people who will be wearing American clothes and fashion and entertainment, movies, music. It's this sort of double standard. It's very interesting because what it raises the question is, how do you define what it means to be something? Like, is it the culture? Is it the language? Is it the race? And I think that's the issue with. I think it's an issue that national Europeans are facing as much as colonial Europeans are at the time present, because obviously, especially these questions of mass immigration and identity, especially in places like Britain, there's this question of what it means to be British. What does it mean to be Swedish? What does it mean to be German? It would seem that some people in say France, for example, would sooner accept a Somalian who had just arrived fresh off the boat as more French than, say, a Catholic from Louisiana who has French heritage. It's a very interesting double standard. It is a question that many people have to ask, and this is what I try to write a lot about, is because I don't believe it's any one thing. Racial idolaters would say it's just your ethnicity that matters in terms of cultural and national identity. And then there are other people, say even modernist Catholics, who would argue it's only religion, it's only assimilating into culture. But I reject the idea that culture is something that you can completely assimilate into, any more than I believe that race is the sole factor that should be what defines someone. It's a position that's ironically more American than a lot of Europeans would care to admit. It's very much this civic nationalist philosophy of revolutionary America. The question must be asked, like, how can Europeans who no longer follow their own culture, language, or religion, customs, or racial identity claim any more exclusive right to define what constitutes being Italian or being Irish or any other European identity? Because you go through Italy and most Italians can't speak their regional dialect anymore. Most Irish people do not speak Gaelic Irish anymore. It's increasingly in Scotland, a lot of people can't speak Gaelic either. So it could even be argued that sometimes colonials sometimes hold a greater respect and reverence for their own heritage than those in Europe. And you see that in a lot of Italian Americans as well, especially in places like New Jersey, as cringy as they are and as embarrassing and superficial and synthetic as they can be. they tend to have a greater respect of what they are than national Europeans do, you know, actual Italians in Italy. And while it may be misdirected or flawed, I think there's a more authentic desire for purpose and meaning in Americans than their national European counterparts. So I think Americans have it in them. I do believe that there are many Americans who crave identity and crave their heritage in a way that transcends the sort of American revolutionary sort of mindset of what it means to be an American. And I think it's always been my belief that sooner or later America will culturally balkanize again. You know, it's going to become this case where the American identity can't hold up forever. And I think any more than I believe that modern France can hold up as it is today, or modern Australia. I believe it's always going to, we're coming to a time when we're going to start balkanizing again, in the sense that people are going to start sticking to more concrete realities like religion and ethnicity than sort of vague abstract notions of what it means to be French, or what it means to be American, or what it means to be Australian.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like I said, that's something to some extent, like in your examples, it all makes sense to me. From my personal context, like I said, I have a little bit of a harder time. I know that even within like you know, a lot of the Hispanics in the Southwest of America are, from a historical perspective, pretty new, and I know even for them, they've started to, not in a way that I necessarily empathize with as much, but they've developed identity problems as well, kind of to a similar extent, where a lot of the, whether they be Mexicans or even Mexicans in different areas, they're a good example, I think, whether or not they're from Texas or kind of California, or versus the ones from Mexico. They have a hard time. The Mexicans in Mexico kind of will reject their cultures that they've developed in these new areas, but their culture that they've developed is oftentimes in opposition to the Anglo culture that was previously there. And so kind of determining, yeah, like, what is the culture of a Californian? What does it mean to be someone from California or from Texas? Texas has a little bit of a weird independent streak going on, so I think it's probably a little bit easier there, but it does make it difficult. Similarly, like you're saying, in places on the East Coast, I think that I've talked to some of my friends as well about, they might live. I have a friend who lives in New York City, and I just don't, as an American, I don't see really what connects the two of us besides our government, any more than like the Canadians I talk to, for example. I don't necessarily feel, outside of the fact that like maybe we root for a national team in the Olympics, or a national tax policy might affect both of us. I don't necessarily see a huge connection culturally between who I am and who an Italian from New York is, or who a Cuban in Miami is. It doesn't. I don't really see that connection existing.
Well, it's interesting because obviously people who have studied the history of the US would know that Mexicans, the ethnic demographic, were a lot more prominent in the South, in places like Texas and California, um, than they are today. And it's more like a re-immigration in a sense, to some extent. The United States exported a lot of native Mexicans from the western southern states in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But it's interesting because you can't. It has to be one or the other, and I think the issue the United States is facing is trying to reimagine what it is through immigration. But the problem is you can't bring back thousands or millions of native Mexicans into the United States and expect it to be the same culture that they've created in exporting them in the first place. Um, and don't get me wrong, I'm a big lover of the Mexican history of California. For example, one of my favorite stories growing up was the Mask of Zorro. The Tales of Zorro that takes place in pre United States California, when it was more tended to be more Mexican and Spanish. But the problem is you can't, like I said, you can't have both. It has to be one or the other. If the United States wants to keep California to be American, it has to impose the Anglo identity that it's created there. But if it wants to import millions of Mexican migrants into California, then it's going to become Mexican again. Which it's fine, but the problem is it's got to decide what it wants to be. Like, you can't be both. It has to be one or the other, because the natural consequence is you can't import millions of people and expect to retain the same culture and identity that you've already created, and getting rid of that exact demographic.
Yeah, this is something I've noticed. One of the things I didn't even know for a long time was a kind of a feeling people had, or a political alliance. Was there some people you see, especially on the east coast of America, who are like they called themselves like old stock, like they prefer like old stock. So like mostly I would be like Anglos and some types of Celts and stuff like that, and some types of Germans, and those are the only people they think have like an inheritance to America, for example, and they would believe in like the removal of Italians and obviously all other kinds of people, which from a practical perspective is unrealistic, but from an ideological perspective is an interesting kind of stance to take. And my issue is kind of what you're saying is I don't really see necessarily how you impose, because really it wouldn't be natural. You would have to impose that view on a place like California or Texas. And especially now when I don't know if California is yet 50% Hispanic, but I would imagine it's very close to getting there in the next decade or so. And I don't see how you necessarily work that perspective onto an area like that. Kind of moving into something that you were previously talking about, or that you had written about before, that's a little bit related to this. You had written a little bit about the formation of exclusive ethnic enclaves, or political enclaves, or whatever you'd want to call it. And you had used Spain as an example, and how these enclaves and these specific Catholic areas kind of provided the fuel that led to the Reconquista. I'm curious how you see something like that applying in the modern context. I have coming up, I'm speaking with someone who runs an intentional community. And so he's started a process like that. Obviously, in a place like America where you no longer have a right of association, that's very difficult. But I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on something like that.
It would definitely have to manifest differently in the modern context than it would historically speaking, because obviously we don't live in a post-Roman Europe where, land is up for grabs for anyone who's willing to, take hold of it. In the reconquest of Iberia, kings like Alfonso VI repopulated Christian lands under feudalist charters, and each charter tied freehold plots to three duties, which is basically maintain walls, man the militia, and fund the parish church. And these communities became the engine of the reconquest of Spain. And it's the same in Sicily, like, after 1071, I believe it was, Roger I, who was the Count of Sicily, he had participated in the liberation of Sicily from the Islamic occupation, and he broke up the island into a series of compact fiefs, usually like a valley or coastal area. And every grant required a stone church, a priest, and a tower garrison. And these communities pretty much played a huge role in the defense of Sicily from further Islamic raids. And it's even the case that could be seen with Hungary, Croatia, and Eastern Europe, which was heavily responsible in keeping the Ottoman expansion at bay for centuries into the Holy Roman Empire and into Italy. But the thing is, in the modern context, it would have to manifest differently. And a lot of people would ask, why would it be necessary to create these communities for such a purpose? But the thing is, when you look at the demographics of Europe, and it's not just talking about the immigration rate, but also the birth rate in places like Britain, a lot of places in Europe are only one generation away from demographic replacement. Whether you see that as a good thing, a bad thing, or a neutral thing is irrelevant. The historical reality is that when one population becomes the majority, they're going to be the ones imposing their own cultural sense of law, order, and values. And the reality is, places like Britain, a lot of places, they're only one generation away from that happening. And you already see a lot of the cracks. You see a lot of more racial and religious violence happening across Western Europe and heavily immigrated. in heavy immigration areas, like in France, you see a lot of churches burning. In places like the UK, you see a lot of women getting sexually attacked from Pakistani crime gangs. I personally witnessed it in certain areas of Italy. I've um, had some Somalians try to steal my watch at one point. It's just the reality that when you import a large amount of people, it's just the values are going to clash, and the ideas of what it means to live in a place is going to clash. And like I said, whether you're neutral against whether you're neutral about the topic, or whether you're for mass immigration or you're against mass immigration, it's irrelevant. It's just the historical reality is that one's going to impose on the other, and it is my prediction based on purely on history and demographics that Europe, and it's not all of Europe, but in many parts of Europe, they're going to follow the same path as a lot of colonial territories in Africa throughout the 20th century. So in the 80s, South Africa was a first world country. It was very culturally similar to Australia. Clean streets, high buildings, even places like Rhodesia, the breadbasket of Europe, of Africa. It only took 2 generations for that to radically change in such a way that we now have refugees of white South Africans fleeing to places like the US and Australia. It only took 10 years for Rhodesia turned to Zimbabwe become an economic hellhole where there was mass starvation, mass violence. South Africa today is, the rape capital of the world. Something like, some statistics show 1 in 5 women. I believe that is the reality that Europe is going to have to face in coming generations. It's not just about the numbers that are coming in, it's also about the birth rates. Some schools where less than 4% of children in attendance in the UK are native white British students. So it's not just about the numbers coming in, it's the fact that our own population is dying off of old age, while the new population, the younger generation, is not heavily swayed in our direction in terms of who the majority is. And my argument's always been, when you see the cultural and historical precedent of what happens in these situations, when you're already seeing violence happen, when you're already seeing terror attacks, religious conflicts, racial conflicts, before the majority has even come along. I think our children and our grandchildren are going to see a very radical time in terms of the consequences of what we're seeing unfold now. So my perspective is, we need to set them up with a fighting chance, and that doesn't have to be as reactionary and violent or out of places, an act of terrorism or something evil or criminal. It could just simply come about as simply living together in a mutual community of shared values and faith and self-reliance. The trend matters not simply because numbers shift, but because newcomers often arrive already organized. Extended families pool cash, voters blocks reinforce one another's faith. Native households, by contrast, have been broken into nuclear units that carry large mortgages and outsource childcare, and seldom see cousins more than once a year. In a contrast between an organized minority and a disorganized majority, organization will win. And when the once dominant population splinters into millions of lone households, while newly arrived groups remain welded together by kin, creed, neighborhood patronage, or just shared religious values. Numbers alone do not tilt a city, organization does. And an immigrant bloc whose members share flats, capital, and Friday prayers, as it grows, begin to treat divided natives much as any strong tribe regards a weak one. And I think we're setting our children and grandchildren up as the weak tribe. A clan based on neo-feudal settlement, sort of primes native Europeans to meet that challenge on equal footing. It begins by abolishing the loneliness that makes people easy targets. Instead of a street full of strangers whose only common feature is a postcode, you have a cluster of interrelated families who share mortgage, a chapel, a weekend roster of fence patrols, first aid drills. young men who might otherwise drift into blissless isolation find themselves apprenticed to cousins in the forge or coding shed, or their shared hours are spent on a rifle range with a volunteer defense club. Young women likewise are protected by not by emergency phone apps, but by a ring of brothers, uncles, and elders who know exactly who should and should not be loitering near the lane or after dark. Predatory behavior, whether it's petty vandalism or intimidation or more organized enroachment, quickly migrates to softer suburbs. And I think that is the reality that we need to set up our children, because if we don't, as I said, they're going to be easy targets. They're going to be the softer community. They're going to be the divided community against the stronger organized one. Immigrant youths testing the boundaries of a neighborhood push until they meet that edge, pushes back. A clan estate provides that edge, a line drawn not in resentment, but in confident stewardship. When migrants discover that the prospective host possess both hospitality and the means to defend it, relations settle into a mutual respect rather than just a zero-sum conquest. And I think that's the issue for Europe at the moment is, a lone woman walking down the street, or a couple living at home by themselves in a street full of immigrants, or in a divided neighborhood. They're easy targets, and they're easy to be picked off. And that's before they're even the majority. What's there to say in 20 years or 15 years or 30 years, when our children do face the reality that they're not the majority in their country anymore, when they're not represented as much in government or the police force. I think they're going to see a lot of what we see historically happen in places like Spain or even Africa in the more recent history. This is why I believe that NeoFeudalism is something that's really important in terms of giving our children and grandchildren, their children, a fighting chance, basically.
Obviously, I think one of the biggest things about getting people to buy in is, I think that, especially now when we have such an absurd amount of comfort, I think that anything that really pushes someone outside of their comfort zone is going to be difficult, obviously, but it's going to be necessary. You see I know in America, we have a couple different groups of Catholics who kind of help each other buy land, and especially more from a homesteading perspective, which I think is helpful, but not necessarily the solution. But I guess kind of thinking of something like that, do you think something like building, I know another thing that's been popular is people building something like family compounds and other things like that. What do you see as being the most organic way to get started? Because I think that when it comes to convincing people to kind of make that jump, that's going to be something that's going to really be necessary, is for it to try to make it as organic as possible. You're talking about people being pushed into nuclear families. I think that's definitely, I was listening to someone, they were talking about how that came naturally from an Anglo perspective of families living on their own, of kind of the yeoman owning himself and not being connected to his land in the same way that kind of a traditional peasant would be. And that's kind of been subverted in our modern societies. I'm curious how you see the creation of these communities coming about most organically.
Our ancestors knew something that we don't, and that is, it takes a village to raise a child. And employment follows the soil. A clan estate sustains half a dozen micro enterprises, like timber milling, metalwork, dairy, a remote work coding studio. Like, each too small for corporate investors, but they're perfectly fitted for us, for family labor. Profits cycle locally. You pay your cousin for cheese, he hires your nephew to repair the quad bike. They both put money towards the parish fund that covers medical gaps for newborn kids. No one grows obscenely rich in these systems, but no wage earner in redundancy away from eviction, which is what the issue that a lot of modern people face. Grandparents live 2 doors down, if not in the same home, so childcare bills disappear. The elderly have a more dignified and joyful retirement because it's not spent in the care of a family and not just in a retirement home rotting away. Homeschool sidesteps tuition fees. Older teens earn pocket money in an estate dairy instead of wasting 4 unpaid years facing certificates that lead nowhere. The psychological toll also eases too, because young parents face life among cousins who drop off casseroles and not among strangers bound only by council rules and postcodes. And in short, the clan estate retools medieval economics for post-industrial scarcity, like, by defusing property, integrating work with land, and embedding welfare and kinship. It converts the pressures of that the pressures strangling the suburbs into advantages. High land prices push us to share ground. Unstable careers push us into plural income streams. Fragile supply chains push us to local production. And I think that's the way that it needs to go about. It can it can start as simple as just living in the same home with your parents. Living in the same street as your siblings and their children. Having your children play together, living close together. I think that's the most organic start. I often talk about the future. Generations and decades from now. The reality of immigration and how it's going to affect our children and grandchildren and birth rates. But we don't need to jump to the end. Things like this take generations to build, and all I really propose is just laying the groundwork for future generations to build upon. And that is very much the attitude that our ancestors had towards these things. Traditionally Catholics, even in America, they live in the same streets, they live in the same neighborhoods. That's why you have Italian neighborhoods. That's why you have Irish neighborhoods. That's why you have Cajun neighborhoods, Mexican neighborhoods. It's just that's the nature of how people have historically lived, and it's by an extension how things like the clan system, how feudalism ultimately came about. Rome did not start as a city or an empire. It started as a little village on Palatine Hill with just a few families. The first followers of Romulus, the first Romans were just people who left surrounding towns and didn't have anywhere to go. And I think that's ultimately how we need to think about it. We don't need to see it as, building a castle on the hill and having like a village of peasants around. Like it doesn't need to begin or even end like that. We have to think about it in contemporary terms, and I think it is within everyone's best interest, especially in this high cost of living crisis that many people are facing, that we kind of need to rely on each other. We can't just keep thinking individually. When you really look at the data on how the modern economy functions, a lot of people are doing it harder. A lot of the average person is doing it harder than people even in the Great Depression in some regards. The high cost of living. Half if not more people's wages are going just to rent. And food and bills, and that's not even including if they have children to depend on. People can't afford to have dependents like children and a stay-at-home life anymore. So I think we need to reinvigorate the system where we do rely on each other. We can't just be in it for ourselves anymore. And that's not how our ancestors lived either. The only reason the nuclear family really exists is because post-war prosperity of the 50s and 60s that our grandparents, the baby boomers, and generations like that sort of reaped the rewards of. My nonna, when he moved to Australia, he bought his land for $15,000 in today's currency, and it's currently worth almost $1 million. It's not. We don't live in a system or time anymore where most people can work 6 days a week and actually see the rewards or the fruit of their labors. They would still just be struggling to survive. And I still see glimpses of it when I'm in Italy. So when I'm in rural villages, you always see the elderly still getting regularly visited from their children. They live together or close together. They still regularly socialize. And the elderly in those countries and those places are way healthier than anyone I've seen in Australia or the US of the same age. And I think a big part of it is just the dignity and social capacity of the way which they live. They don't just get squared away in retirement homes where they withered away and maybe see their children once a week if they're lucky. And I think the practical way to start is just simply living close together, if not in the same home, in the same street, and if not the same street, the same neighborhood. One thing that I always propose to Europeans especially is the fact that land is very cheap in Europe at the moment, and that's because employment is really bad in countries like Italy and France. So a lot of the young people move away from the countryside into the cities, but they still struggle in the cities as well. So something that I propose to a lot of people is to take advantage of this cheap land that's going rurally. Like, You don't need to try to make it in the city. If you know how to utilize land, you can make the most of it. It's interesting the way that a lot of people left Europe in post World War II economy to places like America and Australia because that's where the opportunity was. The land was cheap, the employment was good, the wages were good, and it's interesting that it's almost become the reverse of that now. I've known a lot of people who want to move to Italy, or France or Spain because the land's much cheaper than it is, for example, in Australia, where it's very, very high and no one's going to ever be able to afford it. And I think that's a good way for people to start, is to take advantage where the opportunity is, and ideally somewhere that you have some sort of roots to some extent. Even in the US, there are places in the US you can get cheap land. It's not going to be in the cities. It's not going to be where the most employment or opportunity is in the economic sense, but it is opportunity in the sense that it's somewhere for your family to live and thrive, and for you, somewhere to be able to plant a seed and to be able to grow something out of it. And it's not all going to happen in one generation. You're not going to, like I said, you're not going to see a castle on the hill and peasantry around, within your lifetime, but it's something for your children to be able to build upon. And I think when we live in the modern world, whether it's the modern economy where nobody's winning, modern political system where things are happening no matter what the majority of the people think, I think it's just the reality that people need to stop living by the rules and terms that they're being set and just live themselves, almost like a country within a country.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I definitely agree. I think that I really like the way that you put forth those ideas. I think it's really really understandable, and it's very organic and very approachable. And I think that one of the things I appreciate about the way you articulate is that you kind of started speaking about it from a familial perspective, and you do a really good job at kind of weaving in a bit more of a cultural perspective as well. Something I've thought a lot about is that, if I could leave my children, for example, paid off land that they could either all live on or could continue to build on, and they could live there with little to no expenses, then, like, have land that essentially paid for itself, because paying property taxes and stuff, land is to some extent a liability. And, if it could at least pay for itself, that it really does allow them to stay there and build and live somewhere for a community, and not to have to kind of move to a city, not to give up their roots and stuff like that. I was listening to an interview with someone who I'm going to be talking to soon, and he is building a ranch or a farm or whatever you would call it in Arkansas in America. And he had said he managed to get his monthly expenses for his family below $500 a month. And when you have your expenses that low, and this is before he's even really started producing monetary value from his land, that it becomes a bit of an easier proposition for your family to stay in one place when that's what you've given them. And I think that that kind of ties into what you're saying as well. And kind of my question I was asking about how we can go about building something like that organically.
It's interesting that the two paths, the West is currently in two paths that it can follow right now. I'm not entirely sure which one's going to take. And those two paths are the ones that the Roman Empire, or Roman civilization in general, faced itself. In the late Republic, Rome was facing very similar issues that we are today. The elite owned most of the land. People were living generally impoverished. The middle class had essentially evaporated because it was reliant on slave labor. So most people weren't actually being able to provide for themselves because they weren't finding employment. Most people couldn't afford or get land because most of it was owned by the elite. And political corruption had gone so bad because it was so tied into the financial interests of landholders had become so intertwined with the political interests of those in government. And that is very much the situation that Julius Caesar found himself in when he was in government. And the reason why Julius Caesar was so popular, a lot of the time we think of Julius Caesar as this very right-wing sort of figure, in the sense that he was an autocratic figure, he was a dictator. But a lot of his policies you would almost see as socialist to an American conservative. you would almost see his policies as socialist, because the reason he was so popular is because he confiscated a lot of land from the elite and redistributed it amongst the working class. He put regulations on how much labor could be taken up by slavery. So hence giving employees more reason to hire Roman citizens and not just rely on slave labor, when that's very much the issue we're facing with corporations and immigrant labor, and or outsourcing industry into third world countries. They may not be slaves in the sense that they're working for nothing, but their wages and production are much lower that national Americans and Europeans can't possibly compete with that, because they have a higher standard of living and earnings. So the two paths that America especially is either a Julius Caesar figure will come along and essentially reset the Republic in a way that, like Rome, will make it endure another few centuries, or it'll be like the late Roman Empire and it'll just completely evaporate and collapse in on itself. And it's really interesting because it really depends on who's in government and who's going to actually come along and what's actually going to unfold. But I think we can't put hope in the political system in that sense. We can't assume that a Julius Caesar figure will appear and just, fix the economy and give us all land and bring the elites down. We have to think practically in terms of what's the best chance of our children having some hope for themselves, whether it's facing the demographic replacement or whether it's the economy that they're going to have, the opportunities. I think the biggest thing that we really have to think about is what is within our power to actually do. And I think the reality is following the historical precedent, and some form of NeoFeudalism is the only result. And the thing is, we already live in a system where most people can't afford to own their own property anyway. So I've heard some people argue that in a feudalist or monarch system, some people won't be able to own land; they'll be serfs. But the thing is, the medieval serf had generally a better life than a lot of people do today. They had more holidays, they worked less. A lot of the time, their only real commitments were working a few days a week to their lord or employer, and then spending the rest of the time at home, doing household duties, which admittedly in those days was a lot more tough than a lot of modern household duties, because they didn't have modern appliances like washing machines and lawnmowers and things like that. But the fact remains that people are getting screwed over by modern economics anyway. Most people aren't going to be. Most people, and especially in places like Australia, will never be able to afford their own home. Most will struggle by every week to make ends meet just to feed themselves, let alone their children or wife. Most will never even see their children because they're always in school, which they have to work extra just to be able to pay off. So I think people are facing these issues anyway. So what does it hurt to be able to live communally anyway and live for each other and help each other? I think it's better to live on someone else's land free of charge than it is to be subservient to some faceless landlord who will never really, care about your own best interests, and who ultimately will evict you the next week you can't pay rent. And I think we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. And I think, what have people really got to lose in embracing this sort of lifestyle?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think this is a good point to kind of to end for tonight, or for, I guess for you, it's the afternoon, this afternoon. Is there what is, if anything, would you like to leave? I think that last few minutes we've kind of given a lot of good stuff to kind of leave people with, for them to think about, especially from a kind of call to action perspective. If there was anything that, the people listening, what they've heard here today that you would really like them to come away with, what are kind of your biggest things that you would like them to think about?
I'd like people to look beyond the sort of modern setting or modern understanding of what their identity is, not just see being Australian for what being Australian currently is, and not just look at being American for what it currently means to be American, or Italian or French or whatever country it is. I think we need to look more eternally into what makes us what we are. whether it's culture, whether it's religion, whether it's language or ethnicity. A point I always make to people is the fact that race, nation, and ethnicity all ultimately come from the same shared meanings, and etymologically speaking, to be Italian means to come from the land of the Italians. To be English comes from being the land of the Angles. Scotland, the land of the Scots. Russia, the land of the Rus, and so on. And I think we need to look at more in eternal truth of what makes someone what they are, and it's not just religion, and it's not just ethnicity, and it's not just language or culture. I think it's a cocktail of all these things combined together, and it's not just what we are at the present. America has a longer history than just the past 50 years, and it's got a longer history than even before the American Revolution. And just as being Italian is much older than just the unification of Italy, like we have to look at more deeply into what makes us what we are, and what it is that we're leaving our children in their inheritance and their identity.
Yeah, definitely. I think I agree with all of that. So ending it, where are the best places for people to find your content? You were talking a lot recently about some upcoming writing you're hoping to either publish or writing you're hoping to do. What are some things people can look forward to you producing soon, and where are the best places for them to find that?
Instagram's probably the most accessible place for any of my content, because that's where the most of it is and where I'm most active. I tend to be more active in Substack in the coming months. I don't want to always be on social media. I am on Twitter or X. I don't use it as much, but I am looking to use it at least a little bit more than I currently am. But Instagram is definitely the easiest place.
All right, sounds good. Thank you everyone for coming and checking out the New Crusade. This has been me talking with Caesar Australis. I hope that this information was useful for you. I think it has tied in with a lot of the topics we've been covering recently, and I'm going to be speaking with multiple different people who either have been working on homesteading for themselves or who have been working on the establishment of communities. And so because of that, I think that a lot of the topics we talked about today will continue to be touched on in the future. So please look out for future videos as well. Have a great night. Bye-bye.